Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the generation that was born when Neptune was transiting Scorpio. I saw a couple of different starting dates or years, but I'm going to go with 1957 and ending in 1970. If you're born on either end of that and you're not quite sure, you have to check your own chart to see exactly when, or just a general ephemeris from those times to see when Neptune officially went into Scorpio and when it exited it. So this, in terms of the names of the generations, this will be the last years of the baby boomers and the first years of Generation X. I'm part of this group. I'm the first year of Generation X. And so the two ways that I want to approach this period of time is looking at it from, this situation of Neptune and Scorpio is looking at the historical period of time and how that was, how Neptune and Scorpio influenced that, but also the aftermath of that, the people born in those years that I mentioned and how they ended up. Because remember, if you're born in 1970, you don't even enter kindergarten until probably 1975 or 76. So that's like way after the span of Neptune and Scorpio. So now you're in a different era and you're going to be influenced by that as well. So the other thing is, let's just talk about the influence of Neptune. Neptune is the ruler of Pisces, and Neptune rules the 12th house, which is the house of past lives, karma, the dream state, and it's the house of self-undoing, it's the house of suffering, because Pisces is associated with martyrdom, with, probably because it is dealing with karma. A lot of what we consider to be the negative traits of a person or the self-destructive traits, they can be brought over from other lifetimes, and the person just keeps doing the same old in a new lifetime. And so that's what really karma is. It means action, and when people just take action without thinking first, then they're going to be on autopilot, and they're just going to be like a robot and just like they're pre-programmed or something. So Neptune deals with fantasy because of probably because it is considered so imaginative and connected to the spiritual. So the Piscean archetype is the mystic or the artist, or maybe even both. And so there's this element of escapism that's associated with the sign of Pisces, with the planet Neptune, and even sometimes deception, addiction, and things like that. And then Scorpio is, okay, and so because Neptune rules Pisces, that has to do with water also, when the god of the sea. And so that's, you have water there, which is connected to the spirit, obviously, or you might realize that. And then in the 8th house, which is Scorpio's domain, Scorpio's a water sign, so that's a water house. So you're talking about like two, like a planet and sign, they're both connected to water. So, but this is an outer planet. And one of the things that I noticed when I was looking online is that they're really having attributes, personal attributes connected to people who have um, Neptune and Scorpio. And usually we're not supposed to really do that because it isn't personal, and we look more to, like, for instance, I'm talking about the generational influence, so the influence on the collective, and then also you can look at your own personal chart to see where this falls, because that's going to be important as well. But I suppose just as a generation, you can make certain observations or draw certain conclusions as to traits that that generation will possess as a whole, uh, as like a group of souls incarnating at the same time, I guess you could call it. So maybe it's not so bad to talk about that, but I'm not really interested in doing so. I'd rather talk about the era that this occurred in. And so, first of all, just talking about this, so Scorpio is all about what lies underneath the surface. So it's the conspiracy theorist. It's the person who, and that's a term coined by the CIA to actually marginalize people who think for themselves. So I'm not using that in a derisive way. I'm using that in a very honest way. And I actually call myself a conspiracy realist, not a theorist. But anyway, the point is that the the surface is so pretty and it's so nice, but sometimes what lies beneath is very ugly and very dark. And that's what the shadow is, and that's what Scorpio specializes in, is digging to get to that shadow and not being, enamored by the surface. I think a sign like Libra is actually the exact opposite. They might be kind of um, adverse to anything that's kind of on the ugly side, whether it's physical, uh, unattractive qualities, or the uh, the facts of a situation that are not very pleasant. But the Scorpio tendency is to gravitate towards the taboo, the dark, the secret, and be interested in that. And Scorpio is associated with mysteries, true crime, and all of that. So this generation, when you combine Neptune and Scorpio, there is that kind of stuff that is going on, but it's not what it seems. So an example of this is an event that occurred during this time frame that I would point out, which is the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, who was murdered in 1963 in November. And, November 22nd, 11/22, so those master numbers. And the thing that, and the whole point of that is that it was a very public type of death ritual, if you want to call it that. And then there was also the murder of Oswald, who was the patsy, or the one who they blamed the murder on. And that was live on television. So the point that I'm making there is that, Neptune rules photography. And we had the Zapruder film that came out showing the actual film of JFK's assassination. And we had Oswald's death on live television. And Lee Harvey Oswald, before he died, said, "I'm a patsy." And he had a black eye. And all of this happened on TV. And it's like inconceivable to me, because here we are when I'm recording this in 2022, and we don't have those kinds of things on live TV, those kinds of events. Even though we have live streaming, we have all these kinds of this technology that we could capture things like that. But when have we really done so? Even 9/11 didn't show both planes being hit in real time. So, I mean, I said in real time. So, but in any case, the big thing I would say first and foremost, and actually, I want to credit a site that I used for just to kind of peruse it, called trustedpsychicmediums.com, and they mentioned I don't know if they called it the Cold War, but certainly that period of time when school children were ducking and covering under their desks because of an impending nuclear attack that could happen at any minute in late 50s and early 60s during the atomic age. And this was before my time, but I saw something on YouTube that was kind of like a propaganda film, and it just is like absolutely, ridiculous. They were telling them that they could survive a nuclear attack if they went into the schoolroom or some, nonsense. The whole point was to terrorize the children because that's a form of control. And I think, I don't know the official definition of the Cold War, but my assumption is because it wasn't actually happening, it was just being threatened. And what probably happened is that these people who start wars and who are the controllers figured out that, they could achieve the same goals just by threatening rather than actually having to go through the rigmarole of having a war. And so all of that stuff might have been a lot of theater, and that could be associated with Neptune. But of course, there might have been actual threats, and there was a Bay of Pigs and things like that during Kennedy's administration where they said it was very tense and anything could have happened. Who knows? But Neptune still is this great form of illusion that is creating this terror, because Scorpio can be about trauma. The eighth house can be about that. It can be all of those things that we fear, that, violence, death. Death is the main thing with Scorpio. And, in the tarot, the death card is Scorpio. So there you go. So the fear of death and being able to strike the fear of death. Now, we look at later on during this period of time, during this transit, and we had major, major change from 1957 until 1970. And all you have to do is go online and look at a woman's outfit from 1957 and then compare it to 1967 or even 1970 when it was barely covering her underwear, her skirts. You know, I mean, even I wore a miniskirt, but it wasn't that short. So it was just like the level of change that occurred even within the 60s was so great that I don't know how people didn't just go crazy, because it just seemed like it was quite an upgrade. And of course, psychedelic drugs played a big part in that because it really broke down barriers. And this was definitely the era in which that was used in greater numbers. Not the 70s probably, was more mainstream with all of that, but that the 60s was when it really influenced popular culture in terms of the music and the designs, everything became very bright. So even color TV coming in the mid 60s. So with Scorpio, there is this aspect of transformation. But with Neptune being also, by the way, about drugs, it can be a false kind of transformation because people, and this can happen now. Neptune, as I record this, is in Pisces, the sign that it rules. And there can be similar effects because, once again, it's in a water sign, but it's in this sign of drugs. And so you have these plant medicines like ayahuasca and things like that that people take, and they say that they are transforming themselves through these plant medicines. But the question becomes, is it a true transformation, or is it something that requires the person to keep using that same substance multiple times in order to revisit that state of consciousness? Because Ram Dass, who wrote the famous spiritual book that's very humorous actually, called Be Here Now, and he passed away. I don't know if it was last year, very recently. He was somebody who did experiment with psychedelics, but he ultimately decided to do it the natural way, meaning that he decided to alter his consciousness by spiritual practices such as meditation. Because I think he mentioned exactly, why, but basically because that kind of thing is outside of yourself. I mean, that's how I interpret it. Even if it's something that is producing this experience. And he actually has a story about having some kind of acid with him, um, in the form of some kind of a tablet, I don't know, something like that. And he was in India, and this spiritual guru that he was, I don't know if that was his the one he was following, but he met with this holy man, and the holy man saw him, popping this acid, and he goes, "Give me one." And he was like, "Oh, no, no, this is really strong stuff and all this." And the guy took it like just, and he was like completely the same. So that's when Ram Dass knew that this was not something that a person who's already in a naturally altered state of consciousness, in a higher state of consciousness, that they need anything artificial to get there. But I realize that there's a difference between something made in a laboratory like LSD, which I don't know exactly what he took, or a plant, for instance. But it still is outside of yourself, and a lot of people in that era discovered that you can intellectually know something, or you can have a spiritual experience, but you don't stay there. And one of the unfortunate things that happened during the late 60s, at the tail end of this era, is that hard drugs um, took over from the psychedelics. And one of the things about hard drugs was that it made a lot of people secretive. I remember when Jerry Garcia died that I was really shocked that he used heroin, that he used cocaine. I thought they were just like these acid heads. I mean, now that I think about it, I guess I was pretty naive. But even they, who were associated with Haight Ashbury and the the area in San Francisco where all the hippies went to, they got involved in hard drugs. And those were the kind of drugs that people felt ashamed to admit that they were using. So there is that Neptune and Scorpio of being secretive. And even with pot and other psychedelics, they were illegal. So there was a lot of paranoia associated with it. So you had to keep it, you had to be secretive about it. But I don't want to get into that because I really do think with Scorpio it can be that taboo, that shadow. And with these kinds of drugs, there is that kind of insular, alone type of usage. And if you think about the generation that preceded Neptune and Scorpio, we're talking about Neptune and Libra. And so this was the generation that ended in, or I would say if this started in 57, I guess it ended in 57. But that generation, when it came to drugs, Neptune is going to be drugs regardless, but it had that social appeal. So it was like, hey, let's all pass around a joint. I don't know if in 2000, while we're in this era, if that kind of thing is going to fly anymore. But yeah, so everything became, kind of insular, secretive, and that's why I want to talk about sex. And again, I didn't see anything about this, but I didn't research it extensively, so I'm kind of just talking on my own here. And one thing I would say about this period of time is that it is when sex became something, when pornography really became something that was darker. Okay. Now, anybody who is old enough to remember porno mags remembers maybe you saw your father's porno mag from the 50s or something like that. I remember finding some stashed away. I don't know if they might have been, I don't know what kind of magazines they were, but they had pictures of Marilyn Monroe naked. Whatever. That was very, very mild for those days. And then seeing, stuff in the 70s. Someone threw out a bunch of porno mags, maybe somebody's wife, and, some neighborhood boys found them in the alley and brought them all over. And I was like, whoa, and that kind of thing. The 70s was a time when that kind of thing was becoming more and more hardcore. Now, this generation ends in 1970, but like I said, we have to look at when this generation was growing up, what kind of things were they exposed to? And so when we look at puberty, even on the lower ends of things, I'm talking about the ones born in 1970, 69, 68, they came of age, I guess that's what you would call it, around 1980-81 when AIDS began to make the news, okay? And definitely, they probably were not interested in sexual activity that young, but when they got to be in their teens, it was a full-blown thing. Again, just like I said about drugs, paranoia. And this is one of the things that sex became deadly. Neptune in Scorpio, this, but the Neptune aspect of it is the illusory quality of that. Because again, anything that is fear-based is going to carry some level of deception and illusion. Now, don't get me wrong, AIDS, I definitely believe that's the thing. But I also believe that it was used as a way to repress people from something that is completely natural. It's a very complicated subject because sex is natural, but it also can produce children. It also can create um, problems for people psychologically, physically. So it's not just this casual subject. But the thing is that the hijacking that occurs when you have religions trying to shame people with sex, and you have governments trying to restrict, who can have sex and when, um, all these kinds of things. And you have the medical industry getting involved. All of these things conspire to make sex something that becomes a landmine or a minefield. So that kind of cast a pall over sex when Neptune went into Scorpio, because that generation had to be exposed to a lot of the dark side of photography, the Neptune darkness with hardcore or harder core porn. And then later on they were movies, obviously. Well, they've always been, pornos. And I was just talking to my partner, and he and I we were born in different decades, but we both came from the same area. And we remember when this theater that used to show Disney movies became an X-rated theater, like in the 70s. And so that's what I'm talking about. And the thing that is very confusing about this is because some of you may think that I sound like church lady, and I sound very moralistic and all that when it comes to pornography. And it's not about morals, it's about energy. You know, morals are kind of like these false beliefs that are imposed on people, and it really does, you know, center around shaming people and, making them afraid of their desires and their behaviors and things like that. I'm asking people to really tune into the energy of this kind of thing, and how does it impact people? Does it elevate them, or does it denigrate them? Does it lower their vibration, or does it raise it? I had a professor, an English professor one time, who for some reason was talking about pornography, and he said it's something that it either elevates you. If it elevates you, then it's not pornography. But if it lowers you, it's pornography. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting, because, of course, you can go to a museum and see nudes, and you're not going to be lowered by that. You could actually be quite inspired. And then you have some stuff that's very debasing. So you have to, but there's a lot of propaganda around, oh, this is what it means to be a progressive individual, to have an open mind and things like that. And the mind can really create abstractions. We have to go with how we feel inside. And not the indoctrination, but what it really feels like, the influence from that into our being. And then we will get the information, whether it's right for us or whether it's not right for us. So I think that had a very big effect on things. And I don't know if I've done Neptune and Sagittarius. I think I might have, and I don't know if I mentioned that in the context of Neptune and Scorpio. But another aspect of that with Neptune and Sagittarius is the illusion of freedom, because that generation was able to experience technology in ways that prior generations were not influenced at such an early age. And so they had the world at their fingertips. But what did that really mean ultimately? Did it really expand them or not? So these are very interesting concepts to play around with. Another thing with Neptune in Scorpio is about violence that is coming from drugs. Um, Scorpio is the underworld. So I don't know if I reference gangs. Because I did Pluto in Scorpio, and Pluto's one of the rulers of Scorpio. But here we have Neptune representing illusion and deception and uh, drugs, and we have Scorpio, and that can be this criminal behavior or the black market, if you will. And the thing about it is that I think one of the things that goes along with this is the deception. It's almost like a trap laid for the people that um, felt that they wanted to do that, and it's usually the most vulnerable communities that were um, the ones that were the most impacted in those kinds of activities. And that is a form of deception because it's a trap laid to put them in this criminal system. And so that's one aspect of it as well. And then you had the music that went along with it. So Neptune can be the arts that kind of glorified that kind of lifestyle. And that's when you had rap and that. I'm not saying that rap began in 1970 or anything like that, but that generation who were children into the 80s or teenagers into the 80s, um, they may have started listening to that at that time and they were impacted by it. That's why I say that even if it's a generation that came after it and had its own influences, the prior generation coming of age, they still are encountering certain things that go along with their influences from their generation. So that's why I was saying with AIDS and things like that, and other STDs. It's not just about AIDS. There were other STDs, of course, gonorrhea. Those kinds of things have been around before, but then there was genital warts and chlamydia and things like that. And what happens too that is very injurious is that people feel ashamed, they feel dirty, and that lowers the vibration and their attitude towards sex. So that can go along with that as well. Okay, well, I could keep going on about this. I'm not going to belabor the point, but I just wanted to point out these things, and I hope that this resonated with some people. One thing I do want to mention to compare and contrast the Neptune and Libra, the love generation, with the generation that came after, is this idea of free love, which was associated with the hippies, the generation before them, Neptune and Libra. But it really wasn't love. A lot of it was sex. It was about saying, because the pill came out, which turned out to be something that people should really be careful of taking it because it does have health risks associated with it. But in those days, it was revolutionary because it was so convenient and rather than also having to take it was, I guess it was pretty reliable, but also having to use prophylactics. But anyway, that generation was experimenting with, not just having one partner. A lot of people would get married out of high school or college, and then that was it. They just had one partner for their whole life, and when things opened up like that, it wasn't considered taboo. It was actually considered right on the money to experiment with monogamy. But it was really about the sex. But they had to say love because it was Neptune in Libra, and they were kind of deluded into thinking that this was about love and not lust. So once you get into Neptune in Scorpio, that's all done with. And people, the illusion is over. The people are totally aware of what it is that they're doing, and they're not repentant over it, but they're not necessarily experiencing the lightness that maybe came in prior generations. There's this feeling of maybe heaviness as it is associated with these issues, in part because I think there was a lot of confusion in general. Neptune and Scorpio might even be described as the confusion about transformation, or the deception in transformation. The 70s were called the me generation. And this is because people were turning inwards and they were trying to find themselves. And so, the number 7 is associated with introspection. And I want to do numerology readings where I talk about some of the different decades and how they corresponded to the numbers, the energy of those decades. And so 1970s was a decade of reflection and inner work. But, the cynics called it the me decade because they thought it was very self-centered. And yet, one of the deceptions is the idea that transformation can come through some kind of outer structure, like a program. There were things called EST and, transactional analysis. I'm okay, you're okay, that kind of thing. And definitely, TM is a meditation program that became popularized by the Beatles in the 60s, but it really, I'm sure it took even greater root in the 70s and all forms of religion. And so the 70s became the decade of cults, because people want to transform themselves, but they get deluded in the process, and they lose their clarity because of this. And sometimes that can be a danger, because the person can get sucked into an ideology that becomes very controlling and very dangerous. I do think there was manipulation with that to discourage people from becoming spiritual, but some infiltration. But I do think that it existed in different ways with different groups. And then there was one more thing that I wanted to mention, and now I kind of, forgot what it was, because it was really going into this. Oh, well, I have one more thing that I'd say. I can't remember what I was going to say. But Scorpio, because Scorpio rules the 8th house, and that can be shared resources, Neptune and Scorpio can be this situation where people become confused about the monetary system as it pertains to other people's input into it. What I mean by this is I read a book about the communes that were primarily functioning in the early 70s, even more so than in the 60s. Some of them began in the 60s, but it was really a big thing called Back to the Land movement in the early 70s. And one of the things that the author noted was that some of these people were either, I don't know if they were trust fund babies, or they got money from their mommies and daddies, or they were getting, scamming for food stamps from the government, and talking about the establishment and how effed up it was. So the illusion can come from other people's money and namely how it all fits in together. And there were people that wanted to reject that controlling system when it came to the economics, but they were in denial over how they were getting fed, how they were getting housed. And I mean, I think it was a logical kind of a reaction to the kind of 50s propaganda that was imposed upon the prior generation as it pertained to materialism. And so this, you could call this almost like the second, especially the earlier ones, kind of tail end of the, or even the whole generation, including 1970, because that was during the hippie movement. So they're going to soak up those vibrations or those influences, even if it's at a subconscious or unconscious level. And that is going to, those could be seeds that are planted later for them as it pertains to their attitude towards money. And if they have like a realistic attitude when they're dealing with outer forces or not. Alrighty then, that's what I have for you. I hope that this resonated. If you would like a personal reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.